It's my privilege to invite Dr. Shashi Tharoor onto the dais. Please give a huge round of applause. Anita Pratap is an award-winning international journalist, author, and commentator. She worked for CNN South Asia Bureau Chief, Time Magazine, and several leading Indian media outlets. She is a speaker at global conferences. Her book, Island of Blood, published by Penguin, was an instant bestseller. She has received many awards, including the prestigious American George Polk Award and the Chameli Devi Jain Award. In 2019, Anita was elected the president of the Oslo-based International Forum and serves on the advisory boards of several organizations, including the Lausanne-based Women's International Network and the Vienna-headquartered Women Without Borders. It's my privilege to welcome Anita Pratap onto the dais, and I welcome all literature fanatics, word aficionados, and others to EZHUTHOLA, powered by Xylem. Thank you.
So today our topic is future is here. Adinu nalloru ring undu. It is about progress, transformation, technological breakthrough. പക്ഷേ ശരിക്കും പറഞ്ഞാൽ can we predict the future? ഇപ്പോൾ 30 വർഷം ചോദിച്ചാൽ if you are asked the people 30 years ago, what would the future be like today? What would 2024 look like? Who could have predicted this world of internet and GPS and driverless cars and humanoids? അത് ഈ പീറ്റർ തിയൽ എന്ന് പറഞ്ഞ സിലിക്കോൺ വാലിയുടെ ഒരു ബില്യണയർ ഓൺട്രപ്രനർ ഉണ്ട്. പുള്ളി എപ്പോഴും പറയും, we predicted flying cars. What we got was 140 characters. And even Twitter is not Twitter anymore. So when it comes to the future, what does it mean? Future is here, and Arthana, what does it mean? When we think about the future, it looks like we are rather blind. We cannot see. If you were to ask people who have never seen an elephant, and you blindfold them and then ask them to touch this creature and ask them, please describe this creature. If they touch the tail, they'll say, oh, this is a rope. If they touch the trunk, they'll say, oh, this is a giant snake. If they touch the ear, they'll say, oh, this is a fan. And if they touch the trunk, the leg, they'll say, this is a tree trunk. It is impossible. It's like that for us too with regard to the future. We cannot see. But there are people who are future-oriented, like Shashi Tharoor here with us. So, Shashi, my first question to you is, what does future is here mean to you?
Well, thank you, Anita. First of all, I agree with you. The future is never quite what it used to be. I mean, if you look at predictions about the future at different times, they almost always overwhelmingly got it wrong. Very, very few people were able to genuinely predict the world of the future. And in some ways, some of the attempts that were made were really more ways of describing the idealized versions of the present or dystopian versions of the present. I mean, when George Orwell wrote 1984, he simply reversed the date that he was writing to 1948 to get 84. It was not that he was making a prediction about the world in 1984, and yet it's become an extremely significant metaphor for the future dystopian authoritarian world, which actually was very much an extension of the horrors of fascism and totalitarianism that Orwell had seen in the 30s and 40s. So when we speak about the future, we're really speaking about the present or the very recent past. It's what we have lived through that we are projecting onto the future. So when the topic said India, the future is here, is it future is here? Future is now.
Future is
here. Now.
No,
exactly.
future is here.
And I think I saw an announcement, future is now, but it doesn't matter.
Yeah.
The point is, what can we derive from the trends of the present? I think it's safe to say that 10 years ago, no one could have imagined much of what we've seen in this country over the last 10 years. And to my mind, Anita, there have been some positive trends and some alarmingly negative ones at the same time. The only good thing is if you look politically, then the people have the right every 5 years to reverse the future, if you want, to change the way things seem to be remorselessly heading. And we will be having such an opportunity within the next couple of months. The other way of looking at it is in terms of things like technology, the comforts of life, and so on. And there the government itself has projected a certain kind of future, claiming that India will be a developed country by 2047, the 100th anniversary of our independence. I don't know if that's entirely possible, because my definition of what India should be as a developed country may differ somewhat from theirs. I mean, I really want an India where every single Indian can take for granted a roof over his or her head to shelter them from the sun or the rain, can take for granted 2.5 to 3 meals a day where they can actually feed themselves and their families, can take for granted that if things go wrong and they have an accident or have ill health, that they can be attended to by a decent health center within a 5-kilometer distance of their places of residence, where they have an economy that will give them the opportunity to aspire to a decent job, and with that decent job, the prospect of not only improving their lives, but of guaranteeing a better future for their children. I mean, these, to my mind, are the most basic hallmarks of a developed India. Whereas the government, I think, very often thinks in terms of skyscrapers and highways and ports and airports, which are also parts of development and of the developed story. Now, you can have a future where the hardware of development is manufactured, but the software of development that I talked about is forgotten. Or you can have a future in which you focus on the one at the expense of the other. Some people argue that Kerala has done wonderfully well on human development and less well on economic development. Whereas if you look at the overall figures the government is talking about, they frequently talk about macro numbers. Our growth rate is high, our per capita income is growing. But they don't ask about the people at the bottom of the pyramid. How are people able to live? Did somebody who didn't have a job 5 years ago before the COVID pandemic, did he even lose the prospect of what his job he might have got? Does he have a job today? Does somebody who could afford something at the bazaar as part of their daily diet 3 years ago, can they afford the same thing today? What's happened to people's incomes at the bottom of the chain? So those are questions that people like me ask and are concerned about. Those may not be the questions the government's asking when they see a future of a developed India.
Shashi, you identified the software development, and it's interesting that the person who coined this phrase, future is here, it is attributed to a person called William Gibson, who is an American fiction writer. And he said something of which future is here is only a part of it. As usual, it's a question of taking words out of context, and I think Shashi would know all about that. It's really, what he said was, the future is here, but it is not evenly distributed. In other words, it's a statement against inequality, what Shashi was outlining. So we know from the time of the pharaohs, from the dawn of civilization to now, inequality persists. The question is, how do we address this issue so that we don't carry this poison of inequality into the future?
No, that's precisely the challenge of politics, isn't it, Anita? What is politics? I mean, I've often been trying to explain to younger audiences that politics is entirely about your vision of a better society. And the kind of politics you're playing or participating in is about your preferred route to get there. Ultimately, you might even agree on what constitutes a better society with your opponents, but you may choose a different way of getting there. Or you might not agree on the indices and the yardsticks that constitute a better society, in which case you argue for your vision before the people. So that's what I meant by all this. I think, for example, that I would say I want both the hardware of development and the software. I want both the airports and the highways, because I believe that the common human being in our country can also benefit one day from those. But equally, I want to ensure that people aren't being left out and marginalized from this adventure of development. It's like the question of technology. We know there is a segment of our population that is actually living in the 21st century, and that is really at the cutting edge. I mean, you hear stories every day that NVIDIA, the most famous hardware chip manufacturer in the world now, that apparently 60 or 70% of their software is written by young geeks sitting in Bangalore. But we don't manufacture those chips in India. They do the software work. They're living in the 21st century. The rest of us are still perhaps working on computers and chips of the 20th. And in some ways, you could argue there are people in our country who are living in each of the previous 20 centuries. There are farmers whose access to technology is no different from what their ancestors had 1,000 years ago. It's the same bullock cart and the yoke and the plow that they're still using.
So, Shashi, the question is, how do we address this problem? We know what the problem is. You describe it very eloquently. Point is, what should the governments be doing? What should civil society be doing to address this inequality issue?
Well, what government should be doing is to deliver that future for all of us by being a little, I can again speak more easily for my side of the political equation. We were the party that brought liberalization into this economy. And at the same time, we argued that the fruits of that liberalization, the revenues that come into the government's coffers because of the liberalization, should be spent on supporting the poor, the marginalized, the excluded. And the reason we would do that is not just out of charity. The idea is to give them an opportunity, a leg up, if you like, that tomorrow they can be consumers and customers of the future and participate in the economy that the others from liberalization are thriving by. So that's what we would like to see happening. I don't know if enough of that is happening presently.
So there is another trend that is happening in India, and we saw while we were gathering here for KLF, there was this huge mega event in Gujarat, which was the Vibrant Gujarat event. And believe me, in 5 years, none of us will be able to recognize Gujarat and Maharashtra. It's another state-of-the-art infrastructure that is coming up. My question to you, Shashi, is what we are seeing is there is Gujarat, Maharashtra spinning at another level altogether, and there is the rest of India lagging way behind in terms of investment and infrastructure. What does this do to the fabric of India's unity and stability?
Wait, before I answer that, I do want to point out that while Gujarat has these wonderful figures in terms of infrastructure, and you do have these investors coming and pledging billions of dollars into Gujarat's economy, Gujarat also has abysmal human development indicators. The worst state in India for child malnutrition is Gujarat. It's a shocking fact. I'm not saying this, I love Gujaratis. I have a Gujarati daughter-in-law. Don't get me wrong. I'm just saying it's not about, it's about the political choices made by leaders. They have neglected their tribal population. They have neglected poorer segments of society. So you're talking about a world-class infrastructure, but you're talking about, sub-African levels, sub-Saharan levels of human development. And when you look at the fact that some of the more superficially prosperous states are witnessing high levels of maternal mortality, and a place like Kerala, which is certainly way behind Gujarat when it comes to infrastructure and economic growth and per capita income, though per capita income, because of remittances, we're still not that much behind. The truth is that we have human development indicators that are unparalleled with the rest of the world, with America. I pointed this out in a book called India from Midnight to the Millennium, which is 26 years ago, and it's still true that we have, in almost every regard, that is literacy rate, maternal mortality and infant mortality, a number of hospital beds per patient, number of nurses per hospital bed, number of doctors, number of newspapers per literate population. All of this, our figures are comparable and in some examples better than the United States.
So
and
the question is, what about the disparity within Gujarat and between
now I'll come
Gujarat?
to your question. Fair enough. I didn't forget your question, but I wanted to make that point because we can't be that easily misled by the macro figures. In fact, take per capita income, and then I will come back to your thing. Let's face it, a per capita income is merely a sum total of people, how much we have divided by our number, right? So if Mr. Ambani and Mr. Adani walked into this room, all our per capita incomes would go up immediately. But the minute they left, we'd be going back to being just as poor or humbly well off as we are today, at this moment. And that's exactly the reality. These numbers, GDP, per capita income, they don't tell the full story of an economy or a society, and they mask the reality at the bottom of the pyramid. So that's important to bear in mind while answering Anita's question. But now Anita has asked an important question about disparities, and those are real. Now, there are many ways you can slice these disparities. She talked about how Gujarat and Maharashtra are at a different level of development from most of the rest of the country. Yes, that is true to some degree. But if you look, for example, at states like Tamil Nadu and Kerala, and you compare them to places like Bihar and Jharkhand or Bihar and eastern Uttar Pradesh, you find an equally colossal disparity. Perhaps even more so because some of the basic numbers like literacy rates are starkly different. Industrialization is there in Tamil Nadu, is not there in Kerala, but neither of those numbers compare with what you've got at the bottom of the scale in places like UP and Bihar. So the disparities within our country are stark. And there is a political disparity looming after 2026, which we have to be aware of, and that's the North-South divide. We are looking at a situation where already the southern states pay much more in taxes to the center than they get back, whereas some of the northern states, the so-called Hindi belt, or the cow belt as some irreverently call it, actually receive very much more than they give. So for example, I think Karnataka gets something like 27 paise back for every rupee they put into the national exchequer, whereas UP gets something like 1 rupee 73. I don't have the numbers right now in front of me, but I did the research and wrote this in an article so you can Google it. The fact is that that's the kind of disparity which is beginning to alarm people, and with each successive finance commission, you're seeing significant gaps. Now we have what is called the 16th Finance Commission, just been announced. The chairman has been announced. The terms of reference will soon come. Already in the 15th, Kerala's share of the divisible taxes that come from the center had gone down over the previous 3 finance commissions from 3.9% to just 1.6% of the total tax pool. So when a state government says we don't have the money to do our development choices, how do we address that problem? Where do we find the political imagination at the center to address the legitimate concerns of states that their success in development is being penalized? That if you do well in providing education, you get less money for education. You do well in promoting health, you get less money for health. And is that fair? These are questions people are asking. And then on top of that, in 2026, the constitutional amendment that froze all our Lok Sabha seats in proportion to the population census of 1971, which was designed deliberately not to reward those states that could not control their populations and not to punish the states that did, that amendment lapses. And in the new delimitation, which our present government certainly wants to do, you will find a dramatic growth in the number of seats available to the Hindi belt and a dramatic decline proportionally in the number of seats available to southern India. So suddenly you find a political challenge where in the future, we're talking about the future, the northern states will have a 2/3 majority in parliament to pass anything they want, and the southern states will feel disempowered. So these are very important challenges for the future that need to be tackled with imagination and not seen as business as usual.
So do you see South India breaking away from North India? We used to talk about it in the 60s and the 70s.
No, I hope not. I mean, I think all of us, particularly Kerala, is the wrong place to ask that question, because Keralites would be at a complete loss without the rest of India. There are so many Keralites working in other states. They want to stay in India, they want India to stay with us. But we all need a much, much more broad-minded engagement with these problems. We need, in my view, a slightly looser federation where more resources can be used by the states to pursue their own priorities. I do believe that the priorities of a place like UP or Bihar are bound to be different than the priorities of a much more developed state, whether it's Maharashtra or Tamil Nadu. But equally, we do have a moral obligation, the more prosperous states, to give some assistance to the less prosperous ones. So we just need to find a balance. Now, it can't be a situation where one set of states is already paying more financially to the other and is also losing political power in the process. The combination would be unsustainable. Because obviously then people would start saying, why should we accept this? Isn't this like being colonized by the North? So in order to move away from the risk of any threat to India's unity and integrity, we need political imagination in Delhi. We need people willing to reimagine our federation, including, quite conceivably, changing, for example, the entire composition of the Rajya Sabha to ensure that the southern states would have the ability to prevent, say, a constitutional amendment they don't agree with.
Yes, Delhi needs imagination. Do you find it there?
Not always, no. And not often, and not now very much. But you know, it's interesting. Everyone has their own versions of imagination, Anita. And these guys can
No,
imagine the
no.
past. These guys who are in power now imagine the past better than we can imagine the future.
Yeah.
Reimagine the past is what I meant.
Or reinvent the past, yeah, probably. But you know, the Swedish think tank called IDEA, they do fantastic research on democracy, and they have come out with their report just a few months ago, which said over the last 1 year, democracy has declined worldwide, across the world.
Yeah.
When it comes to India's future, how can we strengthen our democracy, make it more accountable, make the press and the media and the judiciary more accountable, more independent?
I think it depends on the folks here. I think it depends on the citizens of India to demand more accountability from the government. What we've seen in the last 5 years has resulted in an unprecedented development for India's democracy, when the Varieties of Democracy Institute in Sweden, the VDEM Institute, which annually issues reports on the status of democracies around the world, downgraded us 2 years ago for the first time from a full democracy into what they call an electoral autocracy. That is, we elect our leaders, and that is a democratic thing, but once they are elected, they behave autocratically, which is not a democratic thing, it's a dictatorial thing to do. And that is a dangerous situation we're seeing. I remember Jayaprakash Narayan, when he quit politics, wrote that he felt that our democracy was in danger of being reduced to a bunch of sheep electing their shepherd. And you can just imagine the metaphor of the shepherd pushing the sheep around all the time. And he wanted more, and that's why he wanted to strengthen democracy at the grassroots. Well, you folks are living in a state, you're literate, you have the ability to understand, to express your views. I would argue that Kerala's democracy is probably in a healthier shape than democracy elsewhere, but here too, we are finding we have a government that is willing to treat a democratic dissent with contempt, unless we understand that some of the ground rules of democracy require you to be able to tolerate and live with criticisms of yourself. We won't have a democracy for much longer. We are now seeing a situation where every index is worrying. If you look at the global indexes of press freedom, you look at the global indexes of human rights, everything we are plunging down the order. But if you look at the same time at issues like, for example, the way in which investigations are taking place for alleged corruption, but mysteriously only against opposition figures, and even those being investigated, the day they join the BJP, they suddenly stop being investigated. I mean,
So how do we make
like
them
this happening.
accountable? How do we make them accountable? We know what is going on these raids and surveillance and so on and so forth. But the point is, we have reached a stage where we are just seeing all these things. What is being done to make the democracy accountable?
Even in an electoral autocracy, the first and simplest instrument of accountability is the ballot box. You can vote to prevent a government from doing things to your democracy. Now, if you say that you're happy enough with the way things are, it doesn't matter to you, and you don't vote in that regard, then you'll get the government you deserve. That's true of all of us. We have witnessed now, for example, in the course of the last winter session of Parliament, Parliament itself over the years has been reduced to a very great extent into a notice board for the government or a rubber stamp for its decisions. But we've now seen 146 opposition MPs expelled from Parliament for a few days, and a series of bills and laws being bulldozed through Parliament that could have far-reaching effects. For example, there's a postal bill passed that now entitles the government to intercept anybody's mail and to confiscate any item and not even to notify you that they've done so. There is no requirement to notify you. So you can no longer even trust the post office.
But Shashi,
telecoms, sorry.
This audience, for instance, you're preaching to the converted. They vote in a particular way. They're strong about the freedoms, the rights. The problem is what is happening in the north of India, etc., that brings in these sort of trends into power. So
Look,
what can they do? They can vote in Kerala.
I don't think an ordinary villager in UP, if he understood that he was electing people who were going to vote for a law that allowed them to confiscate anything that was mailed to him, I don't think that he'd be very happy about it. I don't think any Indian citizen would be quite cheerfully willing to abdicate such basic freedoms as freedom to receive mail or a parcel in the mail, or under the new telecoms bill, You can actually have any calls intercepted, and you don't even need a judge to rule on. Just a bunch of government officials can decide to tap your calls, to record your calls, do what they like, and they're immune from any prosecution. There is no accountability in the system, in all these laws that are being passed. We have been witnessing the creation of the architecture of a surveillance state. And that's something that I think we all ought to be aware of. I mean, this is not something which I don't think anyone consciously voted for. People voted for other things, and they ended up with a government that's doing all of this too. So accountability is an ongoing thing. So I've written op-eds both on the postal bill and on the telecoms bill. I don't know how many people have read them and how many people feel outraged.
But everyone has to do what they can do. What
That's
you
right.
write makes a difference. Shashi, very briefly going to international affairs, the most important relationship today in the world is between the United States and China. Do you think conflict is inevitable?
No. I think it's not, for one very important reason. Both countries are very heavily invested in each other. America is by far the biggest investor in China, and China holds by far the largest amount of American treasury bonds. And also a lot of Chinese have benefited from American education. We underestimate the benefit China has received from sending some of their bright and brightest on Chinese government scholarships to America, to the best universities. They've learned a lot, come back and prospered in China. So China would have a vested interest in not rupturing that relationship. Plus, of course, America and the West are huge markets for Chinese goods. If those markets disappeared, China would collapse.
Yeah.
Because their entire engine of their economy is manufacturing goods for export to places in the developed West.
So
I don't really see a major conflict between the two, but a sort of a conflict over a subsidiary issue is entirely possible, and the obvious one is Taiwan. Because on Taiwan, there's a certain level of irrationality in some minds in Beijing. And some people in Beijing may well be tempted to say, why don't we march in and take Taiwan? It is ours. And America might well be locked into a commitment to defend Taiwan, and that could create an eruption of a war. But even if that happens, I believe it'll be a fairly short-lived one, because there's too much at stake for both societies and economies to let it get to that point. If it gets to that point, to let it continue for much longer.
We got a lot of lectures from the United States and UK and others, the Western countries, when it came to Ukraine war. And then we see what is happening in Gaza. And there is no explanation over there. And what we have seen is one of the worst humanitarian crises that we have seen in the century. So what do you say about this? And what is the potential of these things, expanding into regional conflicts and destroying the future of millions of people who live there?
Well, I think that the fact that people have double standards in foreign policy should not be news to anybody here. We've seen double standards before, and I think we'll see them again. There is no doubt that those who wax eloquent and outraged about the Russian violation of the UN Charter in cutting across the sovereign border of Israel, and indeed using force to settle a political dispute, that kind of outrage was notably absent when it came to giving Israel a free pass to attack the people of Gaza, but not just to attack, to destroy an entire area, including hospitals, clinics, schools, homes, and of course human lives. The estimates are now in the neighborhood of 30,000, which it doesn't in any way excuse what the terrorists did to Israel on the 7th of October in killing 3,000 people. But this is not only a reaction out of all proportion to the original offense, it is also a palpable violation of international instruments like the Geneva Convention, which governs the rules of war. And yet the custodians of those conventions have been remarkably silent. So you're right that there is a double standard. Will it spread wider? I would like to think not, but anything is possible. Right now, there have already been Israeli strikes on Lebanon, and now an American and British strike on the so-called Houthis, who are Iran-backed fighters in Yemen. So already 2 extra countries have got caught up in this. If tomorrow it gets extended, for example, into an air raid on Iran proper, you might well find a serious risk of conflagration. But to balance that, there are a lot of countries in the Middle East that don't want to see this getting out of control. I'll be very honest and say there are a number of monarchies in the Gulf and so on who would rather that the West and Israel won this war, but won it very quickly, before the Arab street got too restive, rather than that it ended inconclusively and the whole problem were to recur again. So that's my perception. I'm not speaking for anybody else. But I will say that on the whole, 3 months have gone by. Well, actually, we are now well into the 4th month of this conflict, and we still haven't seen a dramatically adverse reaction locally in other countries. For example, in previous such episodes, there was always concern about the Arab street in Jordan, in Egypt, in Lebanon, and to some degree in Syria. We've seen some unhappiness there, obviously some demonstrations, but nothing that has approached the kind of lawlessness that could plunge these countries into turmoil as well.
So from the big issues of the world, we come to the biggest issue of them all, Shashi Tharoor. So, so in 1998, the World Economic Forum, you won the World Economic Forum's Future Leader Award, and that was 1998, 25 years ago. Do you feel you have achieved your full potential?
No, and as I told you, I mean, the future is never what it seems to be, right? so when you look at the future at a certain age and you look back at the future that has become the past, you realize that it was what it was. Look, I mean, Anita, I've had the great blessing of being able to lead 2 careers and 2 lives. I mean, I've had a satisfying life as a writer and an author, and what they grandly nowadays call a public intellectual, and that's something I'm very proud to embrace. And I've also had, as you know, a career at the United Nations that took me to the very, to as close to the very summit as was possible, until it became a case of Groucho Marx's close but no cigar. And then I've had an interesting, challenging, and some would say perhaps disappointing career in Indian politics. 29 years in the UN, 15 in Indian politics, not yet over, unless the voters decide to return me to the world of literature. But I would say that having been blessed to have given my best to both of these, I do feel that I've tried. I mean, I think I'm sort of debating 2 titles. So I see Manishankar Iyer sitting there, and he's just publishing, in the process of publishing his wonderful memoirs. Now, if I were going to write a memoir, I think I might have to call it something like The Man Who Nearly, because a lot of my life seems to be things I nearly did and didn't quite pull off. Or perhaps, more flatteringly, it could be The Man Who Tried.
Yeah, well, that's important.
I did try all the time, and I'm still trying.
And talking about Manishankar Iyer, I met him yesterday and he said, "Oh, I believe you're doing a session with Shashi Tharoor." I said, "Yes." He said, "What is the title?" I said, "Its Future is Here." So he said, "Well, if the Congress party does not win next time, Shashi's future is in the past."
I'm sure that was an off-the-record comment and you've just let him down terribly, but anyway.
No. He says worse things in public. So, no, there is also you also said very recently that you might not, and then again, might contest the next elections. What does this mean?
No. I think, I will contest the next election, but the party decides on things like who gets a ticket. So I'm waiting for the party to make a decision and announce it, but I'm ready if called upon to do so. The question is whether I intend to sort of carry on until I'm carried out feet first, and the answer to that is no. I think at some point one must step aside and make room for younger people, and I have no particular difficulty in admitting that. I'm always struck by the fact that we have the world record for the largest gap between the average age of the population and the average age of the cabinet. And that record we held under Dr. Manmohan Singh also, and it's got no better under Mr. Modi. I think our average age in India is 28 or possibly 29 now, and the average age of the cabinet is 63 or 64. So it is a huge world record because nowhere else is there that kind of gap. And I think that there's something wrong about that. We're a country where 50.1% of the population is under 25. We need to hear more voices. I tried to introduce a private member's bill that would have mandated that the 10 best losers in the Lok Sabha election under the age of 30 should be given seats in Parliament. Just as you have nominated MPs in the Rajya Sabha, you should have 10 nominated by the President, people, only on the basis of how close they came. If they didn't win a Lok Sabha seat, but they're under 30 or 35, have There's some dispute about which is better. But whatever it may be, 30 is fair, I think. Give them a chance to be heard. We have old men and women making choices and decisions for a very young population. Let their voices be heard in the forum in which these decisions are made.
So every talented professional aims to reach the top of his or her profession. And you, as a politician, the natural top place would be Chief Minister or Prime Minister. So.
Are you in a position to offer me either?
I can't even offer you this chair.
No, listen, Anita, all these things are a process. And ultimately, I think, the world is full of people who one can describe as the best prime minister we never had or the best president we never had or whatever. People can have aspirations, but fulfillment of any aspiration in politics is a function ultimately of opportunity, circumstance, popular will, because obviously the people have to vote, and sometimes just plain luck. And, when you look, for example, at the rise to the prime ministership of Mr. Deva Gowda, or even more so of Mr. Gujral, you can see some of these elements there. I don't think either of them could have realistically expressed such a desire. And had they expressed it, I think people might well have laughed them out of court at a certain time. But there you are. I mean, Mr. Gujral had essentially ended his very brief political career and gone off to be a serving ambassador. And then he was brought back to be foreign minister, and within a short while became a consensus candidate for prime minister. Now, this is something which he could not have foreseen. And I would say to all of you that in life and in politics, and maybe the two are often the same thing, always leave room for the unpredictable. I certainly do.
Yeah. In 2013, Shashi, you edited a book called Future is Here, and you covered...
Future is Now.
Future is
India,
Now, was that? Okay,
now,
that's your book, Future is Now.
Yeah.
And in that you had covered all the issues, and you had the young parliamentarians to write about this. And you had a sense of optimism, and you said change is in the air. That was 2013, and the change came, Modi came.
That's true.
So, do you still have that sense of optimism?
Yeah, I define optimism as regarding the future with uncertainty. The pessimist says that everything is bound to go down in the tubes, everything is going to go wrong, everything that possibly can go wrong will go wrong. That's a pessimist. My kind of optimist says, look, if we do the right thing, this can go right. If we get this and this right, we can achieve that. It's not saying that, the Panglossian view that everything is already the best in this best of all possible worlds, and that whatever we do, we're going to succeed, we're going to grow, we're going to flourish. No. I know that every one of these good news stories that our present government likes to spout can easily be undermined by the bad news that they're also responsible for. And that, for example, economic growth can be undermined by social disharmony, one very obvious theory. And similarly, when you talk about the future being bright or glorious or whatever, you're being unrealistically optimistic, whereas what I'm saying is the future is uncertain, but my optimism is I believe if we do this and this and this, we can get it right. And then things will go well for us. That kind of optimism I'm very happy to own up to. The 2013 book, as it happens, Anita, was a compilation of essays by young MPs. They were pretty much all under 40. There may have been one or two exceptions, largely because they were under 40 when I asked them for the essay, and they crossed the boundary when they submitted it. And by the time the book came out, but by and large, it was young MPs from all political parties and from all parts of the country talking about their vision of the future. And I will admit there was a lot of optimism in the air at that time. And Anita is also right that the future came back to this Congress MP who'd edited that volume in a very different way from what we would have wanted. But whatever has happened, again, the people have chosen. And I am enough of a Democrat to respect the people's right to choose, even if they may not choose me or what I believe in. But I also have the right to try and persuade them that my beliefs are what is in their interest and in the interest of our larger community.
In your 2013 book, there is no mention of artificial intelligence, quite rightly so, because nobody had it on their radar at that time. But today, when we talk about the future, it's all about AI and what it means, displacing jobs and all kinds of good things, lots of promises, especially in healthcare, but lots of dystopian views of how this could be misused, etc., etc. So how should we handle, as responsible democracies, responsible citizens, how should we handle this whole issue of AI so that we can benefit and at least minimize the risks?
Yeah, I'm actually profoundly concerned about giving the government one more instrument to control our lives. As I said, when even the postal bill and the telecoms bill have introduced dramatic new elements of surveillance into our lives, if we allow the government to regulate artificial intelligence, God knows how they might give themselves a monopoly to control pretty much all the information available in the society about us, while again ensuring the shield of non-accountability for themselves. So I would rather a much broader stakeholder consultation took place in which we involved the experts, the people working in this field, as well as the government and all of us, before we can even think in terms of regulating all this. Having said that, some regulation is inevitable in every country. I mean, it's like you may have a parliament that will pass a relatively regressive law on some kind of new technology. Look at what's happened, for example, to surrogate pregnancies, which were widely practiced in India, and even foreigners would come and make Indian women have their babies for a fee. That's now become pretty much illegal in India under the law. People are not waking up to pay attention to all of this, but that is a conscious effort by the government to prevent a certain kind of biotechnology or biological technology from going to its logical little extreme. Similarly, you're bound to see some regulation of how artificial intelligence can be used. If you want to see an example of such regulation in practice, look at China, where in China, answers generated by artificial intelligence to questions you can ask outside China will be very different on some subjects, such as, for example, Tiananmen Square. And the fact is that you are in a situation where the world may be dividing itself increasingly into silos in which the internet is controlled by some governments and not by others. Access to information is controlled by some governments, not by others. Artificial intelligence is regulated strictly in some countries and not elsewhere, and so on and so forth. I know which side I would like to be on in that process, and that's in the freer side. And I do believe most Indians would stand to gain from participating in a much freer global system in all these areas.
We have 1 minute before we take questions from the audience. And a last question to you, Shashi, is that one is the amount of changes that is happening. The second thing is the speed of change. So this American inventor, Ray Kurzweil, he says that, if you take from the birth of agriculture to the birth of internet, that is 20,000 years, all the development that has taken place during these 20,000 years, in the next 100 years, we are going to double that level of changes. And that means in 876,000 hours, we are going to double the pace of change, the extent of change that took place in the last 20,000 years. How on earth can human beings cope with this extent of change, speed of change? We have 30 seconds.
Well, I can tell you, Anita, that this kind of change is already happening. I mean, for example, the Oxford Martin School published a report a couple of years ago that said that 30% of the jobs in the world in 2030 will be jobs that don't exist today. So how do you prepare for a future for a job that hasn't yet been invented but will be invented between now and 2030, and that will take away somebody else's job, which is currently doing what this newly invented job is going to be able to do? The only way we can do this is by being as adaptable as possible. Whenever I'm addressing teachers, I keep telling them, don't teach kids what to think, teach them how to think. Because ultimately being able to grapple with unfamiliar information and facts and know how to approach them and find a way into dealing with new things, that's the only skill you're going to need in the 21st century. Because you certainly don't need a well-filled mind anymore. Google can tell you everything you've forgotten. What you need is a well-formed mind, a mind that's adaptable, that's ready to cope with what the world is going to spring on you as a surprise. So I'll leave it there, but I think there's a lot in that question that could take much longer to answer.
Another session. But thank you so much, Shashi, and we are now ready to take questions. We have 15 minutes for questions, so please ask away.
Well, sir, we were hearing a very interesting conversation. Thank you for that. But my question is based on politics. The next election is quite imminent. And you represent very prominently in the India United Front. But my worry, rather my anxiety, since I am also one of the very vehemently supporting that India United Front. But all the political factions, rather the leaders of that faction, are not in unison with the Congress party, which is actually to lead. So in that case, how that is going to be a successful venture in the coming election is one question. Then second question I am putting before you is what is the relevant today of the UN where you were having a very high position occupied? In the present political scenario of international politics, what is the role that the UNO can play as long as the veto power is ever in existence?
Okay, I hear you. So on the first one, there are two things to say. The first is that ultimately each of us has a choice to vote for one person in one constituency. So it's up to us who we vote for. I think that it may well be true that in one state there is an agreement amongst all the opposition parties and you have one unified candidate against the BJP, and in another state you have two or three, in which case the voter just has to choose the person they consider would best represent them. That's the best thing they can do. And if it so happens that there's enough of a divergence of views, maybe the BJP candidate will win, but that's democracy in our system, in our first past the post system. The second thing is to say that India is a large country and the diversities within the country can be seen from state to state. So in Kerala, it's almost impossible to imagine the two major components here of the India alliance, namely the CPM and the Congress, ever agreeing on seat sharing in Kerala. But right next door in Tamil Nadu, CPI, CPM, Congress and DMK are all allied together and there's no debate and no dispute. They already fought the last election together and they're likely to fight this one together too. So there will be a state-by-state pattern and it will vary from state to state. Right now, my colleagues in Delhi are busy talking to the Aam Aadmi Party about arrangements with Punjab and Delhi, though the Aam Aadmi Party also wants seats in a couple of other states. They will be talking to opposition parties in UP. Bengal seems to have, at the moment, run into a bit rough weather, but as the Americans say, it ain't over till it's over, and we'll have to give it some time for some disagreements to be aired and sorted out. I am perfectly prepared to live with a situation where we don't have 100% agreement in 100% of the states, but where we will have sufficient agreement in as many large number of states as possible that preventable defeats can be avoided. I mean, the truth is that that's the best we can hope for. I still expect that the BJP will emerge as the largest single party, but I do believe that their numbers can be brought down to a level where their potential allies required to form a government may no longer be willing to ally with them and may be willing to ally with us. So we have to now give it a try. The most important thing to remind you all is you vote for the best person in your constituency. That's really all you can do. I often point out, people are saying Modi, Modi, Modi. Only the people of Varanasi can vote for Modi. Everybody else has to vote for the best candidate in their places that they think will represent them well. And if they want to vote only to strengthen Mr. Modi's hands, that's their choice. If they want to vote for somebody who will be an effective legislator who has views that are congenial to them, that's also their choice. And I think we can do that. On the UN, I'm afraid it'll take a very long while to answer that question. But simply, the UN has a veto system because of the lessons that the statesmen of the world learned from the League of Nations episode. The League of Nations was formed at the end of the First World War with the same ideals, but many countries who have a decisive influence on world affairs at that time did not join the League, the United States, for example, or were expelled from it, as Italy, Germany, and Russia were at different times. And when your countries are not in your organization, what can you do to influence them? You can't, and so the Second World War broke out. So they wanted to create a world body in which the principal powers of the day would have an incentive to remain. And the incentive was the veto. that nothing could be done fundamentally against their interests because they had the veto. And these were the 5 countries chosen. Today, I would say the UN is still a mirror of the world. It reflects our agreements and our disagreements. It reflects the inequalities that you're pointing to, because that's the way the world is. But at the same time, it also represents some of our aspirations and hopes for a world built on our common humanity. And I'll end with a line of Dag Hammarskjöld, the Second Secretary General, who very famously said once that the United Nations is not a perfect body. It wasn't created to take mankind to heaven. Rather, it is meant to save humanity from hell. And that is the best very often can do.
I think there was a question from there. Yes.
Sir, my question is about accountability, which you mentioned now, about 2 bills which were tabled in the Lok Sabha. So that bills, I think it would pass without much issue thanks to the brute majority. But thinking about it, now I feel that the majority, just because the majority exists, it's getting passed. Because I don't know if it's due to the fault of the Congress being not powerful enough, or if the BJP is having a much more brute political force. In your view, what is the real issue there? Is it because BJP is more powerful that things like this are getting passed? Or is it because Congress is fundamentally weak in itself?
No, I think first of all, the BJP's power is unquestionable. They have 303 seats in the Lok Sabha, which is a convincing majority. If tomorrow they want to pass any law, they have the majority to pass it. And it doesn't help that the anti-defection law ensures that they can issue a whip for a very unreasonable piece of legislation, and no member elected as a BJP member can oppose it, because under the anti-defection law, that member can not only be expelled from the BJP, but can be expelled from the parliament. So after taking all the trouble and expense to get elected, very few MPs are going to be willing to defy their party whip. The second flaw is in the fact that the operations of our parliament have made it less and less of what the founding fathers had intended, and Dr. Ambedkar especially talked about, a forum for deliberation, for a deliberative democracy. And now, many democratic parliaments, for example, have one day in the week in which the opposition sets the agenda. So any issue the opposition wants to discuss will at least be discussed on that day, even if the government is not willing to discuss it on a day when the government controls the agenda. So 5 days in a week, 4 days the government sets the agenda, 1 day the opposition does. We have no such rule in India. So when the opposition demands an issue the government finds inconvenient, the government refuses to discuss it. As simple as that. The issue is never scheduled. Opposition then starts protesting and shouting and entering the well of the House, and they get suspended or expelled. That's really a travesty of how Parliament is supposed to function, and it's a disaster from both sides. I do believe that it is undoubtedly true that whatever the opposition pointed out in a discussion, the ruling party will always have the majority. Well, at least if it has a majority to begin with, it will always have the majority to get its way. But at least the nation would hear other points of view, people would express legitimate concerns, there would have been a serious debate, and it will be on record. You can watch it on YouTube. A judge tomorrow can know what the legislative intent was. Right now, the absence of meaningful debate has created a situation where the government gets its way and no one knows why and how certain things were done and what the objections were. Even this silly example very recently, when all the truckers in North India wanted to go on strike because of something in a law that was never debated, because the opposition was expelled and the BJP got the law through, and there was some provision about hit and run, which the truck drivers say would have made their lives impossible, and they decided to go on strike. Had there been a discussion in Parliament, people might have realized how serious this is. The farm laws a few years ago, was there a reasonable enough discussion? Was enough time given? Were stakeholders consulted? Were farmers consulted? No. So a democracy depends on the willingness of those in power to behave democratically, to consult more widely, to listen to contrary opinions. I'm proud that when I was a minister in my first term in that government, I remember a Congress minister hearing an objection. It was a bill on some health issue. And a doctor MP stood up and pointed out certain things that were not well done and that could have been better drafted. The minister had the grace to withdraw the bill, go back, rewrite it, go back to cabinet, and then come again to the House with a new bill, or with this change that she had recommended. Now, the interesting thing is that in the BJP's case, no bill in the entire 10 years of their rule has ever been withdrawn for amendment, except for an amendment that they themselves wanted to bring. Now, this is not a way in which a parliamentary debate can serve the interests of the people.
We have 2 more questions, so please.
Good morning, sir. I'm Daria Meher, last year history student. So I have
It's
a
good
question.
afternoon, Daria, but sure.
Okay. So I have 2 questions. The first question is based on youth. So it's one of the questions that from your speech I have heard of many times. The first one is based on excellence. As we all know that half of the engineering graduates in India are doing the job which do not require an engineering degree. So it's, we have well-reputed institutions in our country like IITs. But the problem is because of the qualities of the institution, they only select 0.01% of applications as compared to the Harvard University, which select 10 to 11% of applications. I hope you remember this is the similar words from your speech.
I'm glad you've been listening to me. Thank you, Daria.
So what is your question?
So this is the problem that you have been addressed in the speech. So what's the exact solution for it? And the second thing is that as part of the employability that we all know, when we talk to the CEOs, when we talk to the employers, they are not simply satisfied with the quality of the graduates. So they also get unemployed. What's the solution for this excellence and also in the case of unemployability? And the second question is based on international relations. I don't know whether this is somewhat logical or not, that often I get questioned, even the very average students get questioned that even if you're approaching the career in your international relations, as part of your staying in a country like India, you often get questioned about the internal kind of things, what happens in India. Your country is not as much as like your democracy is being declined. Of course, international relations is affected by the kind of internal things that happen. So how do we address to those kind of questions, sir, please?
Okay, on your first one, I think the answer has got to be to have much more connection between academia in the engineering and technological sectors and industry, the real world. When I was minister, we passed a law for polytechnics. If you want to establish a polytechnic in India today, you will not get permission unless you have a tie-up with a real factory or industry within a 30-kilometer radius of your polytechnic. We don't want kids coming out of polytechnics having learned from 30-year-old textbooks and entering a world of work where nothing they've studied is relevant. So that's one example. We want people to be connected. In fact, we got Mr. Narayana Murthy of Infosys fame to do a study on what he called the academia-industry interface. And I believe that would be very good. Certainly in America, it's extremely common for a company to go to an engineering college or a technological institution and say, we have this idea. Do you have doctoral students or postdocs who are willing to research this and work on this project? We will give you the money for them to do that research. We will pay their scholarships and so on. And if they come up with something viable that we can manufacture and sell, your university and those students will get a percentage of the royalty. This kind of thing is very common. It doesn't exist in India. We don't tap the brains of our students. We don't have an opportunity, therefore, for students to be exposed enough to the real world of work and for employers to be fully aware of what's being taught and offered on the campuses and therefore to be able to guide students into what employers expect. We've seen Tata's and TCS and Infosys setting up entire campuses where they actually re-educate people they've just hired. It's not on-the-job training. They actually put them through remedial courses because they feel the quality of what they've learned is not good enough for them to actually face up to the real world. So I would say much more connection, including, a young girl student recommended to me once that they would love to have internships while they're still in college, tied in with places of work, so that while they're at college, they can spend 3 hours, 4 hours a day interning during the college year with a company. The company can see what they're capable of. They can see what this kind of profession can do for them. They might like it, they may not like it, but their future is better guided. This kind of thing would be the way forward, in my view. I'm afraid we've run out of time, so I can't give you a long answer on international affairs, other than to say that we just have to be the best we can be as a country for ourselves and our people, and then we can explain it or defend it to the outside world as best we can.
Thank you, Shashi. Thank you so much. Thank you all for being here. I should take pictures from here. It's so wonderful to see you all. Thank you, and have a nice rest of the day and the rest of KLF. Thank you.